Hey, have I told you about what my dog was doing before? My dog was, she used to chase people on a bike all the time. And it got so bad I had to take her bike away.
Dang, that was pretty good actually.
Did I tell you about the time I gave up my seat on the bus to a blind lady? That's actually how I lost my job as a bus driver.
uh, wow, that's
I was gonna tell you the joke about the one about paper, but it's terrible. Do you want me to keep going?
uh,
I got
that's pretty
more.
good. Let's.
Uh,
I mean, we could just get to the docket today. I think is going to be interesting. I did read your notes, and I have a bunch of stuff that we're going to cover today. And I mean, we'll get to it eventually, but it's just really interesting the history of nutrition and diet culture, especially in the United States. And then, some of the things I think we've forgotten about. And then also the fact that we usually miss the context in which a lot of these like diet trends emerge. So I'll be interested to
yeah.
see where you want to start this conversation. Because there's a
Well,
lot of like really interesting history.
yeah, for sure. There were two directions when we wanted to do this topic when we decided on this one that I thought we could go. And that is you can either talk about the history of diets in like by that I mean like what did what did dieting look like in 1950 and then in 1960 and then in 1970 and so forth. Or I think as you kind of alluded to, the other direction you could go is what did we used to believe that we've sort of got away from and then it resurfaced and we relearned it and remembered, oh yeah, this is actually true. Or we used to believe this and we no longer believe and we know that's no longer true, right? But like so there are a lot of places we could go with this. I kind of just want to tackle it all, but I guess where I'd like to start is just having, and that's kind of why I put on the notes is let's what do we mean when we talk about the history of diets and like is like what are we talking about when we say that? Are we actually talking about? I mean, you remember like the low fat craze, and then it was the keto craze, and then so we could talk about history like that, or we could talk about what are some things that we learned, kind of got away from, and then remembered, right? So what do we actually what does history of diet mean to you? History of dieting history, whatever you want to say. What does that mean to you?
I mean, the thing is, it actually goes back like way further than the 1960s, right? It goes
No, for
back.
sure, for
I
sure.
mean, I think I was working on something the other day, and like one of the first uses of like a diet for weight loss was like back in the
Mhm.
like 1500s when they used to use like nicotine as a
So
dietary supplement for weight loss. But like if we bring
that's
it to the
interesting.
more like I guess modern like historical context, at least in the United States, like back in the 1860s, like weird diet things started. Like back in the 1860s, we have documentation of it. And I think if I remember correctly, um, one of the very first ones was a guy named Horace Fletcher who had a diet that was just about chewing your food a ton of times. And it was like you had to chew
Mhm.
your food like 32 times or more for like every bite to like help you with digestion and reduce your overall calorie intake. And what's really interesting is like that's still a recommendation we have today.
For
Like
sure, for sure,
ch- be more thoughtful about chewing your food.
for sure.
And like we can kind of go through a little bit more of the history, but it's what's really interesting is you can take the view of every piece of dietary history is wrong and like it ended up not being correct, or it's hey, we learned some small truth about it, and then how do we fold
Mhm.
that into what we know today? And so, like in the 1860s, there was that, and then in like the late 1890s slash 1910s, we started to learn a little bit more about like fiber and plant based foods. That came from a guy. He popularized cornflakes cereal, and that came from like what they fed people in hospitals, like long term hospitals. It was called the sanitarium diets, right? These were like high fiber, vegetable diets, really kind of focusing on gut health, etc.
Mhm.
And then you kind of fast forward into like the 1920s, um, the cigarette diet that came out. I think Lucky Strike had a campaign of like reach for a Lucky instead of
Remember?
candy or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, I remember reading something
Um,
about that.
I have to sneeze. Excuse me. And what's always been really interesting is up until recently, everything was really focused on body weight and keeping your body small until now we have kind of that's still a little bit a part of diet culture, but we're starting to embrace things like what is overall health, right? And sometimes the smallest version of your health, smallest version of your body is not the view of optimal health. And so as we like look through a lot of the history of diets, we've kind of gone through, you know, weird things like chew your food, drink cigarettes, uh, eat grapefruit, eggs, and white wine. Like I don't know if you remember that, like Vogue diet or whatever that was
I do
popularized.
remember there was a beer and ice cream diet at one point. I That was a thing, but yeah.
Yeah, and so there's obviously like all these history of diets. In the 1950s, kind of the first real meal replacement, like food shake diet came along. Um, Kind of the Atkins diet came in the 70s, which was really kind of focused more on like, the low carb, high fat thing. Then in the 1980s, there was the low fat diets. And then in the 1990s, like the zone diet came about, kind of talking more about insulin. And then kind of, we've gone into like the paleo diet, whole 30, ketogenic. And I think if we kind of walk through what's been really interesting is if you actually look at where a lot of the more modern diets came from, they came from a few things. One is if you look at the changing demographics and changing landscape of the health of like humans is really where a lot of things came about. So if we kind of skip over the really weird stuff from the like 1800s and early 1900s, we first started to make the association of diet and chronic disease, specifically heart disease, in like the 1970s, right? 1980s. And this is when low fat diets became popular. And what was really interesting is the idea of the low fat diet was based on the concept of high circulating levels of lipids, whether it's cholesterol, triglycerides, et cetera, increase your risk for cardiovascular disease, right? And so they thought they had this idea of, hey, if we reduce dietary fat, we will reduce circulating levels of lipids and we'll reduce heart disease. And what was interesting and that they found is that low fat diets tended to reduce cholesterol and triglycerides and reduce the risk of heart disease. But it probably wasn't due to the fact that they were lowering overall dietary fat intake per se, but that lower fat diets generally tended to lead to lower calorie restriction or lower,
Correct. Right.
right?
Yep. Yep.
Um, and so that led to weight loss, which led to
Hmm.
better overall metabolic control, which led to lower cholesterol levels, lower
Yep.
triglycerides, lower inflammation, lower blood pressure, so less heart disease. But what's interesting is we kind of forgot about a lot of that information. And so if you actually go back and you look at the research from like the 1980s and 1990s, we actually learned a lot about how dietary fat interacts in our diet and how it affects overall total calorie intake. And what was weird was we basically just left all of that information back in the 90s and like we just kind of forgot about it. And then people will, you know, modern day are like, oh, low fat diets don't work. It's stupid. We replace them with like sugary foods. So we eat as many calories. Well, the reality is that's a result of commercialization of food, right?
Hmm.
When you go buy the low fat version of a food, like if you go buy wheat thins, right? I'm just going to use this as an example. Like if you buy the regular wheat thin or the reduced fat wheat thin, they have essentially the same calories. I mean, like one's a little bit lower calorie than the other, but they basically replace some of those calories with a little more like processed sugar, right? Um, and so that's not going to fundamentally change how many calories you consume in a day if you just opt for the low fat version, right? It's like if you have low fat Greek yogurt versus full fat Greek yogurt, how many calories a day you consume is not really based on that. But we kind of forgot about what we learned from the manipulation of dietary fat and the studies that we did in the late 80s and early 90s. And if you actually go look at that data, when you take a normal person's diet and you go from, let's say they have 40 to 50% of their calories from dietary fat and you lower it to 25 to 30, they consume hundreds of less calories per day because they have less energy dense foods. They generally tend to replace that with more satiating proteins and like fiber rich carbohydrates. And so we actually just lost like that piece of information.
Yeah.
And that's one of the hard parts about like when people jump from diet to diet, they don't take the core concepts of what they learned and apply it. They just go to the next like rigid framework of thinking.
Do you think I mean, so after all this, we still don't, like, there isn't here's the best diet overall, right? We don't have, but I think we have, we have best practices, and here's what we know works, here's what we recommend. But it is interesting to me because I think throughout human history, and this goes into the future as well, you're always going to have the next, like, here's the next craze, here's the next fad, here's the next big thing. Do you think that'll ever go away? I don't see that going away. I think it's always going to be like we have this inclination to look for the next best thing, and we always want like the next thing that works. And so I just think that's always gonna be there. Don't you think? Like that's always just gonna be part of what humans do. There's
I
a
think
psychology behind it.
100%. But here is where I think people can really benefit from this. I actually think there's a lot of value in continuing to learn and adapt and find new things, right? Because like if we go back and we look at like let's go back to the crazy diet from the 1860s about like chew your food 32 times or more, right? We learned that if you chew your food a lot, you're probably more mindful, so you're more aware of what you're eating,
Right.
so you eat less.
Right.
Like that is a learning that you can fold into no matter what food you're eating, right?
Right.
If we go back and we look at, hey, why do we think that the cigarette diet worked? Well, we know that like nicotine suppresses appetite. We also know that people just get bored and they have habits, and sometimes they replace boredom with eating, right? Like that's
Right.
one of the reasons why, like when you stop smoking, you gain weight, generally
Right. Because you
speaking,
replace it with
because
something. Right.
you lose the appetite suppressive effect of nicotine, but you also then have this
And
oral fixation you have to like
that's really,
resolve by eating
yeah.
food, right? So we learned
That's
something there. Um,
yeah. That's interesting.
if we go back and we look at like the original version of the Atkins diet, the other like way we could learn that is, hey, that was one of the diets that actually promoted relatively high protein intake, and we learned that higher protein intake promotes more
Satiating effect.
satiety. So like we
Yeah.
actually learned something. And so you can actually, if you take a look at all these things we've learned, like you can just stack all the learnings of how these diets actually worked into a framework that allows you to have a lot of tools at your disposal. Like I think you and I have talked about this a lot in the business sense, but from a different perspective of there's always new things to learn about how to do things in business. And it's not about just jumping to the next thing. It's about, can you take what you learned from the last thing you did and add something new onto it? Right. So for example, because you and I have been talking about this a lot lately, like think about when we talk about sales, right? There's a whole lot of things you have to learn about how to like sell coaching to people, right? You have to understand like what are their true pain points. How do you write effective subject lines that get emails to open? How do you write effective emails to like sell benefits versus features? Where do you place like clickable links in an email? What do those clickable links say? How do you follow up? What do you follow up? It's like each of those things is a piece of the truth of how you get to the end result. And it's about taking what you know and adding to, not just swapping out what you're doing with something new. And the same thing applies to like what
Yeah.
we've learned in the history of dieting, right? And some of it actually ends up being knowing what isn't true. Like there's a lot of things that we spend a lot of time thinking are true but aren't. For example, the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. There is a string of logic that says the insulin hormone, when present, shuttles nutrients into fat cells and makes your body burn carbohydrates and store fat. Like that is biochemically true. And so the idea was, hey, if we eat a very low carbohydrate diet, we have insulin levels low, so we burn more fat. Well, it turns out the acute effect of insulin in the biochemical sense doesn't really matter in terms of actual body weight loss when we take energy balance into effect. And so it's like, okay, this is true, but it doesn't matter. And so a lot of it's also like, how do we test these things and see if they actually work? And when they don't, jettison the stuff that doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. So maybe that's where we want to jump to next and kind of discuss like what are some of those things that we know do not work? And what do we teach our clients, and what can people that are watching this or listening to this take away that if you were to summarize, like if we were to summarize the last 100 years, let's just say, what would those things be? Unless there was a different part you wanted to talk about, but I think that would be beneficial.
Yeah. I mean, I think if we were to, instead of talking about things that don't work, why don't we talk about why certain diets do work and the specific
Yeah.
details of them? And we'll kind of go like, let's go in chronological order. So what was really interesting is in the 1940s, we really started to adopt the concept of calorie balance and calorie counting. And that kind of made its initial like foray into modern culture. I mean, it was discussed a little bit before then, but really became like part of the USDA and food charts and things like that in the 1940s. And so we started to learn about total energy requirements that people have in energy balance. And so that was the first initiation of that. So we started to learn like, hey, these things actually do matter. And then in the 1950s, we started to learn the concept of, hey, can I replace a higher calorie meal with a lower calorie like meal replacement shake and have these convenient foods that can allow me to lower my total daily calorie intake by skipping a meal and just having a shake, like a higher protein replacement shake, right? So we learned that that is a tool, basically replacing a higher calorie meal with a lower calorie meal. Then in like the 60s and 70s, where we started to get the like the first real initiation of the high protein diets, we started to learn that, hey, the guidelines that the USDA put out, that was kind of like lower fat, higher carbohydrate diets, it turns out you can actually eat antithetical to the USDA recommendations
Yeah.
and you can lose weight. So, okay, we're reinforcing the concept of calorie balance, but
What
we're
can
also
I eat?
showing you there's a lot of variety in how you can eat and that there's something interesting about higher protein intake that helps you lose weight. Okay. At this point, we didn't really know if it was like the thermic effect of protein or the satiety, or like maybe you just, after you've had 2 steaks in a day, you just don't want to eat anymore because nothing sounds good. Like we didn't really know. But we started to learn like, okay, if you operate under the guise of calories, but you change your macronutrient profile, you can still lose weight. So we kind of started to add some of those pieces. And then we brought in, the 1980s, the low fat, and kind of the portion control pieces of like the Slim Fast, Medi system, some of these like commercialized diets. And so what we learned from the low fat diets is if you reduce the energy density of your meals, you will lose weight. So that's kind of goes back to a couple things we learned. One, the more energy dense your food, the higher likelihood you have of consuming more calories. Two, the opposite of that is if you have lower energy dense foods, so for more like high volume foods, you're more likely to consume less calories and lose weight. And then the kind of the Medifast system thing, some of the like Jenny Craig stuff that really started to become popular was, hey, if we can pre-portion meal sizes for you and you only eat based on portion sizes, that's also a potential tool that you can use to lose weight. Like portion control can help. Like if you just pre-portion food and you only eat that, and then you're adhering to the calorie requirements of that, you're probably going to lose weight. And then in the 2000s, you know, we introduced like in earnest at scale, kind of low carb, carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. And what we learned was two things. Well, three things. One, the acute biochemical effects of a hormone don't always translate across days, weeks, months, years in terms of energy balance. Really
Yeah.
important finding, right? Two, if you remove basically an entire food group, aka carbohydrates, you're probably going to reduce your overall calorie intake.
Right.
Right. And then kind of coupled on the back of this was the introduction of like paleo, whole 30, food quality, etc. And so what we started to learn was the quality of the food and the simplicity of the food that you eat often drives you to consume less calories because they're less calorie dense, they're more satiating, they drive less food reward. So food quality and quantity start to matter in terms of total calorie intake. And then when we bring in, like the intermittent fasting stuff of like the 2015s to now, it turns out if you skip a meal every day, it's easier to consume less food because you miss a meal. And two, you can learn to have better control over your hunger, like if you learn to just live with it for a while.
Yeah.
So when we kind of stack all those things together, we basically know everything. Like if we take all of those learnings and add them together, we can basically say, hey, total calorie control or total calorie balance dictates weight gain or weight loss. Um, Protein is an important leverage point in your diet. You can eat a mix of carbohydrates and fats, doesn't really matter a whole lot. However, if you have a really high fat diet, it can be hard to control calorie intake because of the energy density and the low volume. Um, Food quality matters because it's easier to eat a calorie balanced diet if you're consuming high quality foods. You get less food reward from simple foods, which makes it easier to stay within calorie balance. Portion sizes definitely matter.
For
If
sure.
you can learn to live with and manage hunger, you're more likely to adhere to a diet. Um, and then, like a lot of the things that don't matter, like trying to do nutrient timing, trying to
Right.
optimize for like insulin, cortisol levels post meal for weight loss, like a lot of those things end up not mattering. So we stack like 100 years of learning into those things, and like we have a really
Yeah.
good framework for diets that work.
For sure. What do you think is the biggest thing people should unlearn? I'll tell you what, like, I'll tell you what I think, and then you can tell me if you agree. I think that the biggest, I don't want to call it, I mean, I don't, let's not call it a misconception, but the biggest, we'll just call it a belief. The biggest belief to me that exists in society that people need to unlearn or believe, at least see differently is this idea that anything, any food is healthy or unhealthy. And I'll give you a little context. I just saw a clip yesterday. I don't know if it was on X or if it was Facebook somewhere where it was like one of those shorts or those reels, right? Where this, I don't know who was interviewing the dude, but he must have been, it was some guy interviewing someone who appeared to be a nutritionist. I don't know. And the question was posed, what do you think is the number, in your business or in your line of business, what's the number one most unhealthy food that you see people eating? And the guy goes, low fat yogurt for sure. And I'm like, what? Like to me, so I heard that and I'm like, I just skipped past it because I'm like, what? But the reason I give that example, and the reason I say that we need to think differently about healthy versus unhealthy foods is my immediate thought when I heard that, aside from what the hell are you talking about, was it depends on how much they're eating and what the rest of their diet looks like, right? It's why 100 times we've said, hey, if you want to eat some cool rancher Doritos, but but 95% of your diet is like whole foods, cool. That ain't gonna do anything to you. That's fine. Like you can have some Doritos. Now, if you're having if your diet is mostly Doritos and you have very few whole foods and you're sedentary, like okay, now suddenly eating more Doritos doesn't seem like such a good idea, right? So it's all context dependent. And so just using these blanket statements as that's an unhealthy food, that's a healthy food. I mean, if all you ate was broccoli, you'd become sick, right? But we don't think of broccoli as an unhealthy food, right? But that's my point. It's like I think to me that is the biggest thing we need to not unlearn, but again, think differently about because I used to believe in that stuff, but once you get into the nutrition industry and this and what we do, you start to see, oh yeah, you know what, context matters, and it's not as simple as that's unhealthy, that's healthy, that's unhealthy, that's healthy, etc. So I just think if people could think about that differently, I think to me that's like the number one thing that we as a society could think differently about and sort of relearn. What do you agree, or what would be like the number one thing for you?
Don't eat foods that you're going to have an anaphylactic reaction to. That would be unhealthy.
So like bees.
So like peanut butter. Like if you're allergic to peanut butter, don't eat peanut butter. Or if you're allergic to peanuts, don't eat peanut butter. I mean, I think here's the interesting thing. I bet if you were to just put a bunch of food out and ask people, what foods do you think would make the healthiest choices? People would get food right. Like it's simple,
Yeah, we know,
right? Like if I were to
and we
just,
know what we're talking about when we say that too.
yeah, I don't think people have a perception problem about what's actually healthy.
Right.
Right. Now there's some things of like, oh, should I eat eggs, not eggs, whatever. Like a lot of those things, I think people just like to discuss them because it's an interesting topic. But if I were to show you 200 different foods, you would classify foods on a spectrum of like good
For
for
sure.
me / not great for me accurately
Yes.
98% of the time. And so what it comes down to
Yeah.
is, how do I think about the food I'm consuming? What are the things I
Yeah.
know that help me create a diet that works for me in the context of my life? And then how do I
Hmm.
consistently make decisions that align with my goals? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I trying to think about the most politically correct way to say this. I
You eat a lot of
honestly
Doritos. I know.
I
I understand.
honestly don't think people who adopt like I only eat meat
Good food.
diet honestly think that's the optimal way to live.
Well,
I think it
there
more
might be a
has to
few.
do with it makes them interesting. It gives them something to talk about. Um, they like the label of being in that group. It makes them different. Like
Sure.
even if like I bet if I were to have conversations with like the people who are the carnivore gurus, like in a closed room behind closed doors, they would be like, yeah, this probably isn't the best way to do it, but it's interesting and I can sell books and like it's probably okay for me for a short period of time.
If they're logical, I think they would say that. If
Yeah.
they're honest with themselves.
Now there's also like a portion of the population that's just crazy. So it could be those people too, right?
That's yeah. I think your point about mapping, if you were to take those people and you have a spectrum of foods, they too would be able to tell you, they would be able to rank or classify these foods in a spectrum of healthy versus unhealthy. Same thing.
Yeah.
Like they would know.
Yeah. And so I think the other piece of like the history of diets that I think often goes underappreciated. When we look at the scientific literature, it's important to remember that the context in which these diet studies are done are very different when they're done in 2020 versus when they're done in 1980.
Yeah,
Right.
for
So
sure.
I was having this conversation with somebody the other day because I was writing a chapter for something, and they were like, "Hey, you can't use references from pre 1990," and I was like, "Why not?" They're like, "Well, because it's just not contemporary." I'm like, "Yes, but you have to understand the context in which studies are done matters." Right. So, for example, I'm going to go to like the pharmaceutical literature here for a minute. If we look at the reason that there has not been major advances in cardiovascular medicine or nephrology in terms of like medications that reduce the risk of X
Hmm.
disease up until
Hmm.
very recently, from basically from like 2000 to 2020, there wasn't much done. Um,
Hmm.
is when you do a trial in 2020 and you have a new drug that you want to give people to lower the risk of having a heart attack of people who are at risk for cardiovascular disease, they're already on all of the other things that lower risk, right? They're already on blood pressure medications. They're
They're on
already on
statins.
statins.
Yeah.
They're already on other lipid lowering medications like phenylfibrates or the like TZDs, right? That those studies that were done in the 1980s, people weren't on anything.
Hmm. Right.
So you're lowering risk. So when we talk about like dietary interventions, studies that were done on like the Weight Watchers diets or the Zone diets or the Ornish diets in the 1990s, population and lifestyle was much different than in 2020, 2025. And so
Totally.
sometimes
Yeah.
you have to look at those old trials to actually start to tease out what made the difference because
Yeah.
now it's much different, right? So the recent GLP-1 trials are a great example of this. What most people don't understand is like if you look at the SUSTAIN trials, the STEP trials, all the big GLP-1 trials that show massive weight loss, they all included lifestyle intervention in which they had set diets and they had exercise. Like that's a huge factor, right? And the
Doesn't that
point I
sort
want
of
to
muddy the doesn't that sort of muddy it too, the results? Like what does that actually say about the drug itself, right? When
well, here's the context of why it matters. We know the way those medications work is they lower appetite, right?
Hmm.
So they
Hmm.
improve the likelihood that you can be adherent to your diet,
Yeah.
right? So when you are given, like, if you go look at the lifestyle intervention trials done in 2010 that are just lifestyle, they're given the same recommendations of here's the diet you should follow, here's the exercise you should follow, here's blah, 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 blah. And so if you look at the adherence data in those trials and how many calories they consumed, and you run the exact same trial in 2024 on this medication, well, the dietary recommendations are the same. They're the
Yeah.
USDA
Right.
guidelines given by an
Right.
RD oversight. Great. Well, this diet trial showed they lost 2 pounds, whatever. Okay, the diet recommendations don't work. Well, that's not true. If you then give them a medication that makes it much easier to reduce your calorie intake because you're not hungry, well, the recommendations work great. And
Right.
so the context of these studies actually really matters.
Um yeah, I just had another thought too, and
I
I
mean,
lost it.
that kind of brings up, one of the things that I had a really difficult time trying to like have conversations with people in the nutrition space in the like 2010s to 2020s when kind of the counter movement came out of like, hey, the reason we actually all became obese or developed obesity was because of the guidelines and their higher carbohydrate and all these things, and they were blaming like, hey, the recommendations changed in the 70s and then we all started to gain weight. It's like, okay, well, let's just assume that the guidelines are the problem. Do you know what percent of US adults adhere to the guidelines? Like basically nobody.
Minimal.
So you can't really blame the guidelines. Like if nobody follows the guidelines, you can't say they're what's
For
responsible. Now
sure.
what you can say is we do a terrible job of actually adopting behavior at societal level to follow some of these things. Now, are there issue with the guidelines? Probably. Could we make them better? Definitely. But like that's one of the things that matters when we think about like nutrition at scale and the history of diets and what people actually do.
I want to jump back to the GLP-1 thing for a second because I think this is also relevant to human history and just the way we are. So it does fit into this discussion about diet history and the history of human diet. But what is really interesting to me is that these people, so people that do the GLP-1s, and for anyone who doesn't know what that is, you've definitely heard of the term like Ozempic or the Mounjaro. Those are those types of things. So for people that get on these GLP-1s, they work, and then when you're off of them, you end up most people end up gaining weight, right? And so what this really highlights to me is how much of what the way we look and the way we live. I mean, the GLP-1s don't address the psychological side of things, right? It doesn't get to it doesn't, because it doesn't change your habits. It's like you said, it suppresses your appetite, but it doesn't change our
Sort of.
habits.
I mean,
But when we go back, when if you get off a medicate, well, in this case, it's not. I guess you could call it medication, but let's say you get off of it, but your habits don't change. If your habits are the same as they were before, you go right back to eating the way you used to because you didn't really address any of the underlying things, right? So I guess my point is so much of what we do. I mean, in our behaviors, like it's rooted in our psychology, the way our weight, the way we eat. It's deeply rooted in our brains, and I think that's just so hard to that's why when people lose weight, in order to keep it off, you have to like work at it consciously for the rest of your life. It'll always be something you have to like work on, like to some degree, right? You can't just like you're always gonna have to be conscious about it. And I guess that's my point. You're always gonna have to put some sort of effort into staying the way you now look.
so I wrote a whole post about this for our Facebook group yesterday, and I deleted it before I posted it because I just didn't I didn't want to deal with it all day
You
because I
should
had so
not have.
much work to do.
Do you still have a draft of that or anything? You should totally
No,
send it
but
to
I
me.
could
I'd love to read
retype
it.
it. So
Okay.
Monday, a there was a presentation given over in the UK at a big conference that published some data about like, hey, within 2 years of being off either like the newest class of GLP-1s or the first class,
Uh-huh.
either tirzepatide or liraglutide, that within 2 years, basically all the weight was back and then some. And so there was this whole like kerfuffle amongst a bunch of the gurus in the fitness space about like, see, these things don't work. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I want to address that, and then I want to address something that you just said about like, habits, behaviors, whatever. That is true, but what I think you have to understand is that is true of every single weight loss intervention, not just medication, right?
Yeah,
If you look
absolutely.
at any diet you follow, any coaching program you follow, including macro zincs, weight loss surgery, is there is a level of return to old behaviors that occurs regardless of the intervention, right? So this is
Yes.
not unique to these medications. This has been true of every weight loss medication before. It's been true of
Yes.
every diet before. It's been true of every surgical intervention before. And there's, some people maintain it just fine. A lot of people have it return. And so you mentioned something about like, hey, these things don't change your habits. I think that's actually not quite true. So for example, like when you have let's say you have a weight loss medication that lowers appetite, right? You are giving yourself a biological signal to change your behavior. So
But
you are
th-
changing your habits and decision making, right? But what you're changing is the pressure on your conscious decision making process. Now, when you remove it, you now bring back this pressure, right? It's like, oh, I feel hungry, so I want to make this decision. And so what I think the actual like answer underneath all of this is, it turns out the things that push on your biology matter a lot, like a lot. And we talked about this in the hungry brain, right? Where it's like, it turns out your underlying biology drives a lot of the decisions you make. And you can manipulate that biological pressure you experience either through medications or slowly through the like environmental stimuli you get. So the food you have in your house, the food you prepare, the habit loops you build, like all of those things are the same fundamentally, right? Now, there's some nuance there and there's like levels of like magnitude of signals and things, but like they fundamentally end up being of the same type and kind, right?
But this, yeah, and just for the record, like, so I think you and I are saying the same thing. I think we totally agree. But th- to sort of counter what you're saying, yes, even if while you're on these medications, you're getting a signal that sort of changes your brain chemistry, changes your habits because of that, the signal that's coming in and that feedback loop. When you're off of it, now your environment is back to giving you the signals that it used to give you before you're on the medication. So your habits then change and you go right. So that's why I say I think you ultimately always have to, like, in order to, no matter what you do, no matter what diet it was on, whether it was a medication, after you've lost the weight, you have to consciously work for the rest of your life to keep it off, because you always have these environmental factors that are sending you this signal, trying to get you to change, and you have to work at, no, I'm going to make the decision to do this instead. So I think we're saying the same thing, but like, it's just, it's not that the medications don't work. They obviously do. Um, it's it's the whole feedback loop thing. It's having to
Yeah.
work at that for the rest of your life.
I mean, so if we kind of fold this back into the discussion we were having earlier about like the history of diets and what we've learned, I think I want to tie this into a little bit of what we do at Macros Inc. because I think this is where like the coaching piece actually matters. And it kind of ties in all of these pieces of the discussion. Like if we look at the history of diets and we kind of went through all those principles we learned about like what helps you maintain calorie control and calorie balance, and
Yeah.
then we layer on this conversation about like, hey, how do weight loss medications, how does bariatric surgery, like how do all these things impact like our overall ability to make good food choices, is you can stack all of those things and these are skills you can develop, right? You can learn how to better manage your hunger and like understand the hunger signals that are coming into your body that like sometimes medications do. Obviously weight loss surgery does, right? um, Food choices do, etc. We can talk about like how do you structure a diet to where you optimize protein intake for satiety? How do you structure a diet that balances your desire for food and your desire for flexibility with the basics of, hey, here's foods that make you feel more satiated.
Mm-hmm.
Here's foods that have all of the nutrients that you need. Here's how you can prepare things ahead of time. Here's how you make decisions when you're eating out at restaurants. Here's how you develop habits around making decisions in these feedback loops. And so like it's taking all of those things together and like how do you build a education coaching program that like develops those
Yeah.
skills and understanding within your clients.
Yep. Yep. What do we? Since we're on that, because I have this on as a talking point as well that I did want to mention is, how do we as coaches, as a coaching company, kind of, I mean, diving into some ways that we help people sort the fact from the fiction and help them do, the things that we're talking about. I also think one of the things that we try to do is, at least when I was actively coaching, and I think a lot of our coaches do this as well, is trying to make people aware of, or at least be curious about what they like. What did you grow up believing? What are the things that you used to do? And then making people aware of that. And then based on that, based on your awareness and what you did believe or what you do believe, we can work on shifting some of that. Because hey, here's what's actually true. Here's what we know. So if we can have context into how people are and what they believed or do believe, then with that context we can kind of shift their perspective, and that's another huge way in how we get people to make progress. Is it's interesting to me how much what we believe actually dictates our behaviors. So sometimes just by believing something different, you behave entirely differently, and then because you behave entirely differently, you end up looking entirely differently, right? So, but I think we also do a really good job, and I'm going to toot our own horn here a little bit, but I think we do a really good job of helping people build the habits that you know that they're going to take with them for the rest of their life. Like um, someone who is not, let's say, someone who's they historically haven't cooked at home a lot. They just never really made their own meals. We don't give meal plans, but we can help you. Like, hey, here's some strategies that you can implement to start getting into the habit of making your own meals and getting you more comfortable with that. And then after a while, it's like, damn, I hardly ever go out to eat anymore. I'm making my own meals. I've lost 30 pounds. So, like, there's just a lot of different strategies and a lot of things that we can do to help our clients do exactly what we're talking about. Is there anything like what would you say you're most proud of from a from a perspective of what we do for our clients that you're like I can hang my hat on that. I'm super proud of that, and here's what we do for people.
Creating a standard for what it means to be a nutrition coach slash personal trainer and giving people what they deserve in terms of a high value service. I mean, when you look at our profession, there's not a lot of places where you have sustained levels of excellence and high levels of accountability within a team to provide a good service, right? Like if you have a personal
Yes.
trainer,
Yeah.
and you go meet with them at the gym, they may be great, right? But it's really hard to replicate that great service and experience to more than one person. And so being able to do that, and like I know that any client who comes to Macros Inc. is going to get a certain level of service that is highly unlikely that they're going to get it anywhere else, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So I think that's one. I think two is kind of going back to your question earlier about like how do people know what's true? If I were to ask, like, let's say most people know that they're not medical experts, right? Like they don't understand exactly how their heart works, their kidney works, their brain works, etc. But what's really interesting is the average person thinks they have a really good understanding of nutrition. Like I remember Rob Wolf, who is he kind of one of the founders of the paleo movement.
You mentioned it before.
He was given a talk one time.
You met him too, didn't you? Didn't you see him at
Yeah,
booth
I
like
had
that?
dinner with
Yeah.
him a long time ago.
Yeah.
It was
That's
10
yep.
years ago.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Actually, really great dude in person. Like him and I probably don't agree on a lot of things, but awesome dude. Really, really appreciated the time I got spent with him. But he was giving a talk and he said, I walked into a room to give a lecture one time about nutrition. And I pulled the audience and I said, hey, I want everybody to raise their hand who thinks and tell me if they feel like they're an expert in 18th century Russian literature. Not a single person raised their hand. And I said, okay,
What
I
the
want
hell?
everybody in this room to raise their hand if they feel like they're an expert in nutrition, like they know quite a bit about nutrition. And like half the room raised their hand. And then he said, okay, how many of you guys have spent more than a couple years of full-time studying nutrition? And nobody raised their hand. It's weird that we have this intuition about we really understand the truth of what's true about our food. And I think it's because we eat every day. So we just have this
That's a good
assumption of
point.
we know, or we consume the media relatively frequently.
Yeah, we all do it.
And so I think what's interesting is outside of like a very few subspecialties, very few people have advanced training in nutrition. They have surface level, but they don't really know how to like weed out the truth. And so I think creating like the next generation of health professionals to be armed with like what is actually true at the clinical level, at the population level, at the behavior level, because like nutrition has this intersection of like biochemistry, biology, physiology, psychology, human behavior, sociology, like how we interact with food, like substance abuse behavior literature. Like there's all of these things that intersect with that. And there's very few people who are trained in all of those things. And so as we train people to do that, we become the next generation of healthcare provider who's like helping
Right.
people sort that out. And so I think that's also a really important part of what we do.
It also doesn't help that people's knowledge gaps in nutrition are essentially prey to being hijacked by marketing gimmicks, companies that are out there to make a buck off of people's, lack of knowledge about it. Because that is where a lot of this noise comes from is you see these ads on TV that are like total BS, but to the average person it sounds plausible because marketing teams are really good at crafting a story or a narrative and making you believe it, right? So like that gets caught up in all the stuff that we end up believing is true when in reality it's not. And sometimes it can be really damn hard to cut through that, especially if it's something that's been beaten into your brain over and over and over and over. It's like, so it can take a lot of, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance to overcome on some of our beliefs. And, but I think your answer was really good. I think we really do. There's something to be said about the fact that we're not like, we don't go out there. I was thinking about this today, actually. We don't go into our social media group. We don't go into Facebook. You don't go in there. I don't go in there and say things that are like, to give you an example, you ever, when you log onto our business page, like the Facebook one, and you go to like the home page and you see your feed, I don't know what you see, but what I often see is the first thing that'll pop up is like, um, just some ripped person's physique, and it'll say something like, it'll have like some bogus claim about nutrition about it. And what I see is that post has now gotten 30,000 likes, hundreds and hundreds of comments, and people that want to get in on that particular thing. We will never be the type of company that will use something like that or use a photo to get likes and attention, to get marketing, clicks up if it's not true. And the unfortunate thing is the truth doesn't always sell. A lie sells better sometimes, or something that sounds too good to be true sells much better than here's the actual truth. And our job is to continue to cut through that noise. And what I take pride in is that we'll never be the company that, even if it'd be the easy road to take to sell these gimmicks or these marketing ideas, we'll never be the company that does that. We'll take the harder road. It may lead to, not as much, interest, but there's something called integrity, and I think we do a good job of just being true to who we are and trying to help people.
What's the God, I'm totally blanking on this. What is the bias that's like you say you want one thing but you actually want the other? This like really came out in the like 2016 election or whatever. It's like false preference bias or whatever it's called.
Want something, but you really want the other. Let's ask our AI friend, shall we?
I just like
The
totally
bias
having
you're
a
describing is
brain
likely
fart.
a form of confabulation or self. No, that's
No.
probably not going to get cognitive dissonance, self deception. But you're looking for an actual term. I don't know. I'm not
It's
sure.
like
I've never heard of
uh
it. Social
pref-
desirability bias.
preferential bias. I can't remember the exact term, but like
Okay, whatever.
this shows up so strongly in consumer behavior around like the weight loss diet industry. So for example,
Mm-hmm.
I've probably spent in my career $2.5, $3 million in meta ads, right? Like over the 10 whatever year career I've had. And we have run so many tests that have done the like, body positivity ads. Like you put the average person on an ad and then you put the like super ripped fitness model on the ad. You run the exact same copy, exact same demographics, and the clicks, like the actual behavior is so different. Like what we say we
For
want
sure.
and what we actually want are very different. And it's really wild to like see it in the data.
This says maybe this is. I don't know if this is the right term, but I think it's touching on what you mentioned. It says preference falsification. Definition: this is when
Yes,
someone
preference
publicly states.
falsification. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah, public. This is when someone publicly states a preference that differs from their true private preference, usually due to social pressure, fear of judgment, or self-image concerns.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Um,
Coined by Timur Kuran, a political economist. Anyway.
and so this is one of the conversations that have tried to have with clients over the history of my career, and this is something that like I personally struggle with. And there's somebody I follow in the fitness space. I'll leave him unnamed. Um, and it's a little bit related to something different, but like, want what you want.
Yeah.
Who cares? Who cares what other people think about what you want? Just want what you want. If you want abs because you want to look great, awesome. There's no problem with that. If you want, to just be healthy and move well and don't care what you look like, that's great too. Like, just don't want something because of what somebody else says you should want.
Unless they say that you should want ice cream, in which case I'm definitely down for that.
Or if you want milk in your coffee, that's just wrong, no matter what. Although that's not true. Sometimes I'll put a little bit of cream in my Americano. Occasionally.
I have a quick question for you based on what you're wearing, because I can see your whatever you want to call that.
Hey!
Like,
Where did you get those clothes? At the toilet store?
I've been waiting to hit that button again for a while. I just haven't, so I just thought that your shirt would be good. Not that mine's any better. I'm wearing just a plain gray V-neck, so it's all good. I just really wanted an excuse to hit that. I thought, I mean, we're wrapping up on time here, but I thought I like this episode. I actually have an idea for this based on something you were talking about. We were discussing earlier. I think maybe the next topic I have sort of the next coming episodes planned out, but what I think
no.
we may want to do, what would be a good follow up, is diet culture. Like, I'll talk to you about this behind the scenes about what I mean, but like just kind of the diet pressures that people feel, and sort of how diet culture has shaped our minds and our beliefs. It kind of ties into some of what we've talked about. Maybe we could talk about that on the next episode. But um,
Only if you
do you have
give me
any?
$100.
I'm just gonna skip right past that comment and ignore it.
Okay.
So, do we have any? We have a couple minutes. Do we have any comments from anybody? I know it's a long shot. It's kind of last minute, but if anyone does have a comment or a question, fire away. Although you have a meeting coming up, don't you? So you probably can't stay too long. You have a meeting after this?
I do.
Yeah.
Turns out my work days get very busy very quickly. It's almost like we have a lot of clients we got to make sure are taken care of every day.
That's yeah, it's true.
I mean,
I spent a lot.
before we go, just kind of circling back to the conversation we had a little bit more like earlier about like what am I most proud of? I mean, I think not to toot our own horn. Well, I guess I'll just toot our own horn very unapologetically. Being able to do what we get to do for our clients every day is probably the most important thing any of us will do in our careers.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you think about in a given week, how many clients interact with a Macros Inc. coach, and the fact that they're adding days to their life, years to their life, maybe decades, the quality of those years are improving, the relationship they have with food and how they live their life, and like if you think about all of the things that you can do for humanity, I can't really think of anything much more important.
Absolutely. It's a good
Right?
thing that I can. I mean, we can
Like
wake up every day and feel like, hey, we're making a at least we're trying to make a difference. Like
like
I
if I
wake up
do
every
the
day feeling
math,
like I
yeah, if I do the math of all the clients we've worked with, like realistically, we can probably say the work that we've done is probably going to allow 2 or 3,000 more people to walk their kids down the aisle at their wedding than would have otherwise.
for
Like if
sure.
we just do all of the math, like it's maybe even
Yeah.
10,000. Like that's 10,000 more weddings that daughters will get walked down the aisle by their father. Like that's bonkers when you think about it from that perspective.
I know you got a jet, so I'll just wrap it up with this.
Toodaloo.
I spent a lot of time, money, and effort childproofing my house, but the kids still get in. I don't know. It's weird.
But
Adios. Thank you all for watching. I'm gonna duck out of here. Let me get our little outro video. You can duck out of here, Brad, if you gotta go. I'm just gonna say bye. Later, peeps.